Peter Hitchens. I am a columnist for the Mail on Sunday. I'm the author of a book called The War We Never Fought, known in the publishing trade as the book they never bought. For the very simple reason almost nobody reviewed it, and those who did defamed it and abused it. Whether they read it or not is between them and their consciences, but it was not a welcome subject, as indeed it is not here. And one of the reasons I'm here tonight is because in this building particularly, there has been a great reluctance for any voice to speak up in favour of laws against drugs being maintained as they are and being enforced. And a huge number of people, all too willing to follow the lead of the sickest, greediest lobby in Western society today in calling for the decriminalisation and or legalisation, many of them don't know the difference, of cannabis, which I prefer to call marijuana because the proponents of cannabis legalisation hate it when I call it marijuana. So I will. It is a long history. If you go back to a Home Affairs Committee on which David Cameron sat, it was about the only thing he did before he suddenly became Prime Minister, to another Home Affairs Committee some years later, they all come out with the same, more or less the same argument. The war on drugs has failed, therefore we must soften the law and be nicer to people who take drugs. Ladies and gentlemen, there has been no war on drugs since approximately 1973, when that well-known Trotskyist revolutionary Lord Hailsham of St. Marylebone, then Lord Chancellor, made a speech to the Magistrates Association telling them how to interpret the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act. I'll come to that in a minute. It's a fascinating piece of legislation. He told them that they should stop sending people to prison for marijuana possession. 1973. The head of the Scotland Yard Flying Squad was able to say in 1994 that cannabis was in effect a decriminalised drug. It is astonishing. In many, many parts of this country, the streets and houses smell of it. It is astonishing that there are still people around in the broadcasting business, in the media and in politics who do not realise that in fact the law against this drug is no longer enforced. It's also extraordinary that people who are almost obsessive about the wickedness of the drug trade, who go on quite rightly about the appalling devastation wreaked on Afghanistan or Colombia or Mexico by the drug trade, never ever point the finger at the principal culprit in all this misery. That is, the rich, selfish, heedless criminals who buy the drugs in Western countries, about whom we do nothing. You might just, if you sell drugs in large enough quantities, feel the wrath of the law. You might just, if you traffic in drugs and bring them across international borders, feel the wrath of the law. You might, if you're actually growing them, feel the wrath of the law, but actually buy them and supply the money which makes the whole thing worthwhile for the gangsters, and nothing will happen to you at all. Again, if you want the details of this and how it was achieved, my book is available at any good library, and those of you who are feeling generous might even buy it, because amazingly, despite the calumny heaped on it, it's still in print 6 years after I wrote it. So, fundamentally, the premise of almost everything which is said about drugs is false. The idea that there is a war on drugs that has failed. Something which has never happened cannot have failed. There has been no such thing. The 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act was a very, very cunning de facto legalisation, particularly of cannabis. All of you will know about the strange categorisation of drugs, A, B and C. The cannabis moves up and down, sometimes it's B, sometimes it's C in this list of things. But what it never is A. And that is the whole reason for the categorisation at all. The brilliant campaign in 1967, financed by rock stars and run by a very, very clever American, a campaign called SOMA, named after the great controlling drug in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, sought exactly this outcome. What they were afraid of was that marijuana would be classified along with bogeyman drugs, LSD and heroin at the time, which people were very much afraid of then, and that it would therefore be seriously pursued by the law. They wanted to give it a separate category. The other thing they wanted to do was they wanted to make sure that the crime of possession, which, as I've said, is the whole sustaining central crime, the heart of drug crime, the absolute sine qua non without which there would be no drug crime, that should be treated separately from sale and trafficking and manufacture. And so it was given a separate status and attracted completely different sentences. These were the achievements of the great petition of 1967, the advertisement in the Times, and the Wooden report, which followed, written by that wonderful left-wing battle axe Baroness Wooden, and a group of people on her committee, all of whom agreed with her. It contained nobody remotely sceptical about her propositions. And although Jim Callaghan made some rude noises about it at the time, the Act was about to be passed by the Labour government in 1970 when Harold Wilson called his June 1970 election, and it fell. And that is why the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act dates from 1971, because exactly the same Act, word for word, comma for comma, colon for colon, was then passed by the Conservative government of 1970, which won that election. I don't know of any other instance of a major controversial bill which has ever been put before Parliament by both parties in exactly the same form. And if you can come up with one, let me know. It's also the only Act of Parliament with a permanent revisionary body attached to it, the Advisory Committee on the Misuse of Drugs, which constantly meets urging for it to be made softer and softer and softer. It's a unique piece of legislation, far too little studied, and it has been very cunningly used by the lobby inside the Home Office and outside the Home Office, which seeks over and over again to weaken the prosecution of people for the offence of possession of drugs to the point where it doesn't really happen anymore. The great discovery that Baroness Wooden and her friends had made was that you could continue to obey international law, even if you sat on the United Nations Security Council. You continue to obey international law by having on your books the laws which the International Conventions on Drugs oblige us to do, but you didn't have to enforce those laws. That's what's been done. So here we are. We've had more or less 40 years of the most radical and most extensive and most ambitious experiment of drug decriminalisation in the Western world, in this country. And now, as a result of that, we have many social problems of the kind which many of you will be familiar with and which I may describe later in questions and answers, but we have them. And these problems are being attributed falsely by the drug legalisation lobbies to the failure of a non-existent war. They should by rights be attributed to 40 years of de facto decriminalisation, which is the real reason for it. This simple point, backed with figures, backed with facts, I made to the Home Affairs Committee a few years ago. I was a witness before it, just before Russell Brand. I have a feeling that the committee listened much more to Russell Brand than they did to me, because although their report noted my contribution, nothing in what they did or said reflected any of the facts that I had put before them. They simply went ahead with the attitude which they already had. This country's political and media and education establishment has been seized by the legalisation lobby. And it is quite extraordinary how they're getting away with it. So the thing which amazes me perhaps most of all is that nice, liberal, furry, herbivore, vegan, left-wing people who have fair trade coffee and drink oat milk support this filthy, greed-inflamed, billionaire lobby for the making of profits out of human misery till the end of time. And they believe it is a left-wing and a liberal and a radical cause. And I am astonished at this cognitive dissonance that anybody could live and do that, but many people do. I'm equally astonished by the idea that anybody, I know that the Conservative Party is a disastrous failure on any count you get, and I have no time for it whatsoever, but how anybody could go into politics under the label of Conservative and support the legalisation or the relaxation of laws against a drug which does so much to destroy both order and health and all the bonds which should bind us together as civilised people. How anybody who calls himself or herself a Conservative could do that, I do not know. Which brings me to Mr. William Hague, Lord Hague, or wherever it is, Lord Hague of Pints of Bitter, who actually has come out openly demanding not just the decriminalisation but the legalisation of cannabis. And here is a huge and significant change. Of course, as I've explained, it's virtually impossible, even if you go and smoke it in front of a police officer in Hyde Park, to get arrested for possession of cannabis now. But legalisation goes one step further, and to understand exactly what it means, you should study, and it's very long, Proposition 64, passed recently by plebiscite in California. Proposition 64 contains many provisions for legal cannabis in that state. But one of the most fascinating is that it contains provisions for advertising. What happens with legalisation is that instead of just being handled by criminals and by the comparatively minor distribution networks that they have. The product can be sold, marketed, put in shops, advertised, promoted by product placement on films and in television, in the way that alcohol is, and to some extent cigarettes are. An enormous, huge increase in the ability of the manufacturers of this drug to connect with the public, to market and to sell and to advertise with all the immense skills. And if you don't think the advertising industry has any skills, remember, Anthony Charles Lytton Blair became Prime Minister of this country thanks to the advertising industry. If they can do that, what can they do for cannabis? Just think about it. It is going to be, if they succeed, enormous. It is also going to be enormously profitable, and it's going to be transformative. Leave aside any other speculation which one might have about the increase in mental illness, about the increase in violent crime, which I personally believe would follow a greater abuse of cannabis in our society if it became legal. Imagine what would be necessary simply for the functioning of society. The school bus driver, the surgeon, the airline pilot, anybody with any kind of control over sensitive machinery, over any kind of delicate work would have to be subjected constantly to tests to see if he or she was actually under the influence of a drug which remains in the body for very long periods, because unlike alcohol, which is water soluble and leaves the body quite quickly, it is fat soluble and remains in there for a very long time. We could have to have, if it were permitted, an enormous amount of intrusion into everybody's private life. They wouldn't know that you didn't take cannabis. You would be faced with this in your office, in your work, all the time, simply to allow the functioning of the country above the level of a third world slum. Because could we possibly allow airline pilots to fly in a country with legal cannabis until we check that they haven't been smoking it for the previous week? Would you? Nor would I. These things would become necessary, and there are things which people don't think about. And yet, somebody who was actually leader of the opposition and leader of the Conservative Party can stand up in public and call for this disastrous policy. And nice left-wing vegan people who wouldn't hurt a chicken can call for the legalization of cannabis, which will lead, I promise you, if it comes, to the devastation of huge numbers of families in particular, who will see their younger members have their lives ruined, their education failed, their careers collapsed, reduced in many cases to, I'm afraid, hopeless, incoherent and lost persons who will never get their mental health back, and in many cases could only live in society with huge doses of antipsychotic drugs. There are examples of this, and one of the saddest examples of this, and I only make it public because the principal victims have already done so, and it is described in a book which all of you should read, a very harrowing book called Henry's Demons by Patrick and Henry Coburn. This happened. Patrick is a friend of mine. Patrick is, if you don't know it, probably the greatest foreign correspondent of our time. His son Henry attended a Canterbury grammar school, starting at the age of 11, and was introduced there, as far as we know, to marijuana. And he underwent the terrible things which are described in the book, and the awful devastation and misery which was inflicted upon his family by what happened to him is something which is almost unbearable to read. Now, when Patrick wrote this, and Patrick writes in nice, liberal, vegan newspapers, not like mine, when Patrick wrote this, he was approached by very large numbers of people who said to him, I couldn't tell you this before, but the same thing has happened to me. I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, this, even while cannabis remains illegal, is a very, very widespread phenomenon. There are no statistics about it because who would pay for the research? Who's interested in knowing? At the moment, no. Politics isn't interested in knowing. Politics has fallen over sideways. Politics has decided that it's cool with cannabis legalization. The media, the same. Full of people, supposedly conservative, who will say, no, well, I don't find, why should we criminalize people for this harmless activity? All the time. The Daily Telegraph, ladies and gentlemen, has for years been in favour of cannabis decriminalisation. The Daily Telegraph. And the Times also. The other papers, you can pretty much assume there is no resistance. And so it goes on. And it's time, it seems to me, that somebody apart from me, somebody apart from Melanie Phillips, actually stood up and said, this is a grave mistake, because there is one other vital fact about the legalization of any drug. Once it is in, mass use, and it is legal, you will never, ever be able to ban it again. If 20 years from now, everyone's walking around saying, as they often do, Peter Hitchens was right. If they are, and I think they will be, there won't be anything you can do about it. And my ghost will be floating around the corridors of this place, if it's still standing, saying, I told you so, why didn't you listen when you could do something about it? And that is exactly my point. Why don't you listen while you can do something about it? Why not stop this? Why not resist this greasy, wicked, cynical propaganda from people who only want to make money, who know the price of everything and the value of nothing, and who are happy to inflict on thousands of people appalling, lifelong misery in return for profit in some cases and personal selfish pleasure in others. Stand up to them. It's the last chance you're going to get.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchens, for his fine speech. We'll now open up the room to any questions. Are you happy to do two at a time, or would you like...
No, one at a time. Two at a time is a horrible Blairite thing.
Exactly.
Trying to make sure none of the questions get answered.
Right. Who would like to go first? Yourself, if you'd like to stand. Thank you.
What would you say to people who say that people have the right to put drugs into their body and it's part of individual freedom for them to take drugs?
If absolutely nobody in the world loves you, and you don't care about anybody, and you have no family, then I suppose it's possible that you might be able to say that. But even then there'd be a problem, because if as a result of putting these things into your sovereign body, you ended up gibbering in a doorway and the state had to pay for your upkeep and for the rest of your life, which means that the state doesn't really do it, that your fellow creatures have to stump up the money to pay for you because you've damaged yourself. It's not a victimless crime. If you have family, the victims are very close, and the crime and its effect is lifelong. If you don't have family and you have no one who loves you, then of course it's also lifelong, but they're not close, but it's still a wicked and selfish thing to do. No man is an island unto himself. We simply are not that free. And it is a huge fallacy to imagine that by doing things which will have a potentially dangerous effect on your mind, you're affecting only yourself. It simply is not true.
I wonder if you'd be able to extend slightly more on why you think it will lead to an increase in violent crime, because I work at the BBC and we often have people coming on who suggest very much the opposite, so I was just wondering if you could extend slightly on that.
Marijuana has had brilliant PR for a very, very long time, and the idea that it is a peaceful drug and that everybody who takes it is just nice and relaxed and dreamy and laid back is commonly believed. It may well be that in some cases people, while they are actually under the influence of marijuana, this might be the case. But the problem with marijuana is it has a cumulative effect, and where it affects people's mental health, it affects them quite badly. And the correlation, when I began in journalism, there were lots of local newspapers, and they had librarians, and they went every day to the magistrates' courts, and they went to see the police, and they reported crime in detail. Nowadays, that's almost all gone, and most crime in this country simply goes unreported. The only subset of crime in this country which is thoroughly reported is terrorism. And do you know what you will find when you examine the case of almost all terrorist killers? The killers of Lee Rigby, just for instance. In America, the Jared Loughner, who shot a huge number of people and badly wounded a congresswoman in Tucson, Arizona. The Paris Bataclan killers, the Charlie Hebdo killers, the man who attempted to start a terrorist attack on a Thalys train, the Tunis beach killer. I have an enormously long list. Every single one of them was a long-term cannabis user. And the connection is so strong. I would say I haven't time. I don't want to reel off all these figures here. Anybody can go to my blog and they can see these lists. They're very long. I can also produce cases. There was a terrible instance a few years ago of a church organist in Sheffield who was beaten to death while on his way home on Christmas Eve. His assailants turned out to be cannabis users. There was no sense in the attack. It had no purpose. It was purely gratuitous violence. And it was this sort of thing. And every single time that you examine these things, and as I say, terrorist incidents are examined, and major crimes occasionally examined, you will find the same thing. The connection between, the correlation between marijuana and serious criminal violence is strong, and it needs to be explained. And I call repeatedly for an inquiry into it, and I get no response. Because again, all the interests are on the other side. Nobody at the moment is interested in discovering anything wrong with marijuana because it is on the verge of a huge, carefully coordinated, brilliantly run and extremely expensive campaign for its legalization. So the last thing they need is this kind of discussion that we're having tonight. But I promise you, the evidence points to a very strong correlation between cannabis and violence. And I believe, I've often tried to get police interested in this, I believe if an edict went out that every single violent crime should be examined to find out about the drug use of the criminal, that you would find that correlation extended way beyond terrorism. It's the only reason it's attached to terrorism, because terrorism is actually studied and nothing else is much.
Could you say something about the experience of those countries where they are, or states in the US, where they have actually legalized cannabis? Because I believe there is quite a lot of evidence about the effect on society, with, you know, like in Amsterdam with these drug cafe places and all that sort of thing. I just wonder why there isn't more evidence out there about this. To face up with these people who are so in favour of legalisation, they should be taking the experiences of those states and countries that have underwritten this measure.
Yes, I agree with you. The problem with research isn't just done. Not everything is researched. Somebody needs to pay for it. And there is, say, no established interest, either in government or in commerce at the moment, which is particularly interested in researching the downside of cannabis. And take, for instance, the alleged drug paradise of Portugal, which the Cato Institute has proclaimed as being a huge and glittering success for depenalisation of drugs in that country. Subjected to any kind of examination, again I must direct you to an article on my blog called The Portuguese Drug Paradise, subjected to any sort of careful examination, and it fades away. Lifetime drug use has increased. A lot of what was introduced formally in Portugal had existed before. What drug problems Portugal had before depenalisation it still has now. There's been no miracle. Recently in the Netherlands, where in fact in many parts of the country the lax attitude towards marijuana is deeply unpopular. In Hague, in The Hague, the administrative capital named after William Hague, they have recently passed a law banning the smoking of cannabis in the streets because they're so sick of it. The legalizations in North America were actually preceded by what I regard as a more or less fraudulent use of the medical cannabis to create a de facto legalization. You could get cannabis supposedly medical under almost any excuse. So by the time legalization actually came around, the difference or the difference between what had happened before and what happened afterwards wasn't very great. Very often a law is changed after it has been very feebly enforced for some time. So you can't expect a cliff edge. The cliff edge will come when full legalization takes place and the big companies begin to move in the way that tobacco companies used to operate with cigarettes, with advertising and promotion. And that will be the time when a very considerable increase in comes about. At the moment, it's far too early, in my view, to say much about Colorado or any of the other US states that have done it. And much too early to say much about Canada, which only a couple of weeks ago. So I would hesitate that a lot of the evidence which is put forward is partisan, and I don't trust any of it, even if it suits me, on these immediate, quick results from legal changes. Be careful with it, but in general, the evidence from what has happened here in this country is pretty strong. And this is, as I keep saying to people, this country is the most ambitious and widespread experiment in drug decriminalisation in the Western world, and the longest running. Yes, please.
I'm actually from America, and Colorado is recreational, and it's created a sense of growth in economy and tourism for like the rest of the country. But medical is somewhat, harder to come by. Isn't that what's setting on the ballot? And what would you say about economy and tourism being, impacted if y'all were to legalize it?
Well, this is what I say about people who know the price of everything, the value of nothing. You could legalize slavery and tax it if all you cared about was government income and economic prosperity. There has to be a limit. Governments didn't legalize such things as prostitution and brothels and drugs and gambling because they felt that these things were deeply harmful to society. And I would cite as an example of how government greed damages society the terrible catastrophe which has happened, particularly among the poor, as a result of the relaxation of gambling laws in this country, largely under New Labour, but not put right perspectives. And this gives you an example of what, again, could happen. And then government becomes dependent on these revenues and becomes party to the greasy, nasty thing which it has mistakenly relaxed. I don't care, frankly, about the income of the state controller of Georgia. If his income drops by $1 billion, if it means that 300 families won't have their lives ruined by a member of their family becoming permanently mentally ill, that's okay by me. Yes, please.
Bringing back to the terror attack point, are you seriously suggesting that cannabis had any role in that, more so than Islamic fundamentalism? I think.
I love questions which begin, "Are you seriously suggesting?" They're always have a sort of wide open mind. What I'm seriously suggesting, as I say, and as I repeatedly said, and as I write over and over again, sometimes in letters of 36 points, so that people will get it. What I'm saying is that terrorism is a closely studied subset of crime, and that in that closely studied subset of crime, which information is available, a very large number of violent criminals turn out to have been habitual cannabis users. That is all I'm saying. No, I'm not making excuses for Islamic fundamentalism. No, I'm not doing that. That's a lie. I'm not saying all cannabis users are terrorists. No, I'm not saying that. That's a lie too. I'm saying what I'm saying. Okay? Is that clear? Is everybody else clear on it? Good. 36 points, letters. And it's on my blog again. You can read it. Yes, please.
So you propose quite a believable theory that politicians are generally on the side of liberalising drug law. How do you explain the dismissal of Professor David Nutt from the ACMD several years ago, which seems to go against that theory?
I would explain the dismissal of Professor David Nutt in many ways, but I think that there is a point you have to understand about politicians and drugs. They like to pose, or have until recently liked to pose, as being opposed to the legalisation of drugs. Whenever you ask a government minister or an opposition spokesman, they'll run a mile from any suggestion of, or until recently would have run a mile from any suggestion of decriminalisation or legalisation. They are aware, I think it would be impossible for them not to be aware of the facts about what's going on. And this is a default position. It's candy for the electorate. They don't really mean it. Professor Nutt, it seems to me, was a useful piece of triangulation for a government which had no interest whatever in enforcing the laws against drugs, but wanted to look as if it was tough. And he gave himself to them as a sacrifice, and they willingly accepted it. That would be my analysis of what happened in that case. But the result of it was not that the laws against marijuana were toughened. In reality, the moving of marijuana from Class C to Class B didn't make any difference, because if nobody's prosecuted and nobody's sentenced, the fact that the sentence is higher doesn't really make very much difference, does it? This car will go incredibly fast if there's any fuel in the tank. If there's no fuel in the tank, it'll still stand absolutely still, and that's what happened. It was a completely phony piece of posing, like so much of what government does.
It may be worth noting that I think that was about 15 years ago as well.
Slightly more than that, I think.
It was more recent than that. It still doesn't matter. Anybody? I'd tell yes, I'm doing this. Yes, please.
Very early on in the speech, you touched briefly on the topic on the international law you mentioned.
Yes.
And I think that's something I'm personally quite ignorant on, and I never really hear people speaking much about. Could you go more into what our obligations are under treaties we signed, and what the implications of those treaties might be going forward?
There are and have been for many years conventions. I think it's called the Single Drug Convention, but I don't claim to be an expert in this, which obliges all signatories to it, which is practically every UN member, to maintain laws against certain listed drugs. The basis of our drug laws is international. In fact, the basis of the law against marijuana is very well described by Malcolm Muggeridge in his wonderful memoirs, Chronicles of Wasted Time, when he describes his time in Cairo and the terrible, disastrous damage which was done, particularly to young people, by the widespread use of marijuana there. And the British administrative chief there at the time, a man known as Russell Pasha, was the man who pressed on the then League of Nations the need to have international legislation to prevent this becoming a global problem, and that's where it originated. It's been updated since in various ways to include more and more drugs. But we are signatories to this convention. We're obliged to maintain these laws. The real target now of the legalization campaigners, and they're very active on this at the United Nations, is to get this convention changed so that, in fact, countries can legalize cannabis, and the things that can happen that I predict will then happen. But I am very puzzled by Canada, a country which makes a great thing about its United Nations seriousness, that it should openly actually have defied international law. But I think for us, as a member of the Security Council, openly to defy an international treaty which we had signed and ratified would be beyond, I don't think we can bring ourselves to do it. So, but there is, as I say, it runs in parallel to the domestic campaigns. There is a strong international campaign for the revision of that treaty so that legalization of marijuana will become possible in domestic jurisdictions, and that is the next thing. This is what prevents it. This is one of the reasons why the legalization is proceeding state by state in the USA. The states, of course, don't belong to the United Nations. So the federal government can continue to pretend volubly that it's enforcing the law, even though it isn't, but the states can do what they like, and then eventually the collapse will come. And by that time, probably between 36 and 45 of the states will probably have ratified marijuana legalization laws. And then it will come, and then the banks will be able to handle the money, and then see what happens. But at the moment, it has to be carted around in cash, which is a slight restraint. But as soon as it's federally legal, then the banks can move in, and the stock market will pow. Anyway, sorry, yes. Right over there, please.
Billy Caldwell's case had rightly received quite a fantastic amount of sympathy. Why do you think Henry Coburn's case didn't receive anywhere near him? I haven't even heard of him until I've actually got him away from the train yet.
You're talking about the Charlotte and Billy Caldwell case, right?
Yes.
Yes. I think there isn't anybody in this room who isn't sympathetic to Charlotte Caldwell, and to have a very, very seriously ill child who is constantly at risk from terrible convulsive fits it breaks the heart, and nobody is not sympathetic to her. And it's the kind of thing which any newspaper and any television program will automatically reach for. The story of Henry Coburn doesn't have quite the same poignant drama, I would say that. Simply speaking, from as a journalist, it doesn't have the same power. It has a great deal of power, but not the same. The problem with the Charlotte Caldwell case, and I have examined this, and so has Rebecca Hardy, very interestingly in the Daily Mail, is that Charlotte Caldwell isn't the only person involved in it, and is to some extent surrounded by others who have other interests. And I would commend people, it's on the web, again it's mentioned on my blog, to read the Rebecca Hardy analysis of the film. But I would say, passing on from these personal unhappinesses, which we must all wish to see resolved and assuaged as much as possible, to point out to you that in 1979, a man called Keith Stroop, whose name you ought to know but probably don't, who has always been a very prominent campaigner in the American National Organization for Marijuana Legalization, NORML, said, in my view rather unwisely, but he thought he was among friends, in an interview with the American University newspaper, the Emory Wheel, that he proposed to use medical marijuana as a red herring to get pot a good name. He did go through a stage of denying this, but I actually found the original article, and I promise you that it is there, and he did say it. people say, well, he said this an awfully long time ago. I said, well, yes, he did, but that doesn't mean he didn't mean it. And it is my view that if cannabis is legalized, within 10 years, you'll never hear another thing about medical marijuana. It is a Trojan horse, it is a red herring, it is designed to get pot a good name. It has no real other purpose. You will almost never find, and this is in many cases not the fault of the individuals involved, you will almost never find a person who is calling for the use of marijuana as a medicine who isn't in some way accompanied by, besieged by, or infested by organizations which are calling for the legalization of marijuana as a recreational drug. And if I were campaigning for the legalization of marijuana as a medicine, I would keep so far from those guys, you wouldn't believe it, because I would think that it would be much, much more likely that I would succeed if I wasn't associated with them. So you have to ask yourself why that always is. For all I know, there's enormous uses for medical asparagus, or medical artichokes, or medical rhubarb, or my favourite, medical broccoli. These are all projects which we might pursue. Many things presumably have hidden medicinal properties we don't know. But the medical cannabis thing has marched in step with the campaign for the general legalization of it, and I think it should be viewed with suspicion. And I would say one other thing about it, because of the mental health problems which are correlated with marijuana. Many drugs are, on the face of it, and at first attempt, extremely useful. The most famous of these is thalidomide. All of you will know what happened to large numbers of babies who were born to mothers who'd taken thalidomide. Some of you may not be as aware as you ought to be of why their mothers had taken it. It was an extraordinarily effective treatment for morning sickness, which is an absolute scourge for pregnant women, and it was really very good at it indeed. It was a miracle drug, as so many things are claimed to be, but alas, it had a side effect which made it unusable. And the testing of drugs is an immensely long, complicated business. You can look up, it's all on the web, the testing of Sativex, one of the drugs which the National Health Service actually prescribes on some occasions, using THC, the principal active ingredient of marijuana. The idea that the Home Office in some way blocks experiments in medical marijuana is simply false. There is, I won't tell you where it is, but there is in Kent a large legal marijuana farm with government sponsorship to allow experimentation on precisely that. It's a complete lie that the government is obstructive about this. It's false. But the fact is that the testing of medicines is an amazingly painstaking, slow business. You cannot license them until you are sure that they're not another thalidomide. And again, we have to be extremely careful. It might be all very well if a marijuana-based medicine treated you or cured you for some very serious medical complaint, but if it left you permanently medical ill afterwards, it wouldn't be much use, would it? And this is the care which people need to take on this subject, which by and large they don't.
Peter, can I
Yeah.
point to that? So, further to your point, sir, and yours actually, with regard to the Conservative Party, Professor Nutt was dismissed by the Labour government, and I think that's relevant because what we have seen since is actually the Conservative Party, or figures in and around the Conservative Party, pushing harder towards liberalisation of marijuana rules and laws than the Labour Party were. And Gove described the education establishment as the blob. I think what we are very quickly seeing is a blob in favour of marijuana legalisation, and that's really where the money is. We've had figures like William Hague come out and call for it. You couldn't really get more big C conservative establishment than that. And I'm aware through friends and colleagues that the money is flowing to those that are willing to promote marijuana legalisation. So,
well, I'd be very glad if you would point me in the direction of any facts and figures on that, because I would love to make them public.
Well,
not now, not here, but later on.
No. I think
we're
we're already somewhere there, because the article you referenced in the Mail made very clear the linkage between the Billy Caldwell case, which is a terrible case and one that I personally believe is the right of the parent to decide the best course of medical action for the child. But they are surrounded by lobbyists whose primary interests, quite frankly, are not in the care of the the patient, but in the legalisation of marijuana.
Well, maybe they are interested in the care of the patient. Let's assume.
But they didn't
let's always assume the best.
They didn't get into lobbying to care for patients. They got into lobbying
Possibly not. You may be onto something.
for different reasons. So I think that it's important to note that actually it's the Conservative Party that are pushing this harder than the Labour Party.
Well, there are a lot of nominally Conservative people are, of course, involved. There's the Adam Spliff Institute is very prominent in this, and the Institute of Economic Affairs as well. Both organisations which, if you ask them whether they take money from big tobacco, will hum and haw and cough a bit. But I think if you look in the files, you'll find that maybe perhaps they have. So, but these people are supposed to be Conservative. I mean, I don't think they are, but some people think they are. But it's not uncommon in the Conservative Party and in what is called conservatism. All three major parties are deeply involved in this, and none of them is to be trusted, in my view. Yes, it was meant to be you last time, actually, so it's your turn.
Thank you. Addressing the issue of how we can stop legalising of cannabis, as an evangelical, I've virtually written off the Church of England, but the Church of England does have an influence, especially on the Conservative Party, Conservative government. So I encourage you to use your platform as a public speaker and a commentator to shame the established church to speak out on this issue. I mean, after all, social evils through recent centuries have been challenged by the established church, often with great effect. So I just encourage you to do so.
Thank you.
So one institution
Bear that in mind.
mentioned.
I don't have enormous influence on the church. For some reason, I can't. Yes, please. Yes, you.
I want to ask, you said that Tory government is pushing this a lot. Last time I checked, the largest cannabis farm in the world was in Norfolk, and that's got a stake to do with GW British Sugar, and that's owned by the husband of Miss Atkins MP and Miss May. What are your thoughts on the government investigating this?
I'm unmoved by this story. It doesn't seem to me to have any bearing on anything. As I've said, it's perfectly legitimate for the government to permit the growing of marijuana plants for medical experimentation. I don't have any difficulty with that at all. I don't see any conflict of interest. Indeed, I encourage it because the only way we're going to resolve this argument about medical marijuana is if these claims are thoroughly tested by the proper methods, and to do that you have to allow that. I think it's one of those stories that goes around, and the minister involved has recused herself, I think, from any discussion of it, quite properly, but I think almost certainly excessively. I don't think it's important, honestly. Yes, please.
Hi. Do you think the legalisation of marijuana will lead to the legalisation of harder drugs or things like that?
Legalisation of what?
Of harder drugs, other drugs.
There are no harder drugs. This is the great myth. This is the great myth.
Oh, I'm sorry, but it will lead to the legalisation of more drugs.
Well, what has already happened, beyond doubt, as an inevitable consequence of the failure to arrest and prosecute the possession of marijuana, that crime, is that the possession of other drugs, notably heroin, is largely unprosecuted as well. The figures which were obtained by Nicola Blackwell when she was MP for Oxford West on this are in my book, and what you see is that the numbers of arrests remain more or less constant every year. The authorities are going through the motions, probably, if we could get up-to-date figures. And figures on these things are quite hard to obtain because neither the Home Office nor the Ministry of Justice seem to keep them in a way that's helpful in my experience. And the old Office of National Statistics, which you used to be able to go to, is now a website which is beyond easy to manage. But undoubtedly, once you have said that you really don't care about the existence of and prevalence of one drug in society, then people take the message you don't care about the others. Everybody knows, I think. I know the BBC. There are no drugs used in the BBC at all. You know, there's nobody who uses these drugs. But in some large media organisations, it's quite well known that quite a lot of people do take cocaine quite a lot. And this sort of thing is quite common in English middle-class society. And when did you last hear of anybody being prosecuted possession of cocaine. Indeed, there was the famous case of the Rousings who were caught with it in the American embassy, and nothing happened.
Stephen Fry made a book out of it.
Well, there is that too, but he wasn't caught at the time. And then there was the extraordinary case of Pete Doherty, the alleged singer, who was actually in a court building, answering, I believe, a charge of drug possession. And as he was walking through the court building, he was observed by a security man. There are no police in court buildings anymore, except as witnesses. He was observed by a security man to drop certain things from his pockets, which turned out to be more heroin. He went home. He wasn't. There is no serious enforcement even of the bogeyman drugs that people will claim to be terribly worried about. The allegedly hard drugs. I thought you said hard drugs. This is the use of this term, and the use of the term soft drug to describe cannabis. It's one of the biggest lies in modern society. Actually, probably you could use heroin and cocaine for some years, and you would have physical damage beyond that, but you would probably be able to resume a normal life. But you might well use cannabis for a few years, and you would never again be able to live a normal life because of the damage to your mental health which would follow. It is a more dangerous drug, and a very hard drug indeed. A soft drink has no alcohol. A soft cop is nicer than a hard cop, but to call cannabis a soft drug is a lie. And the whole use of the term hard drug, soft drug, is part of the immensely clever marijuana PR campaign. Yes, please.
As a sort of old revolutionary, I'm sure you'd accept that the best formulated arguments will crash onto the rocks of people's experience. Their experience doesn't match the argument, they just won't listen to you. And I put it to you that years of politicians and people in the media and people in the establishment all over the world have listened to this speech from their fathers and their grandfathers and grandmothers, taken plenty of drugs which they're not going to admit to, and come out of it successful in their fields. And so now when they hear this, they're just not interested because it doesn't match their experience. Now I accept all your arguments about the money pressure, but if you're just talking to people who in their heads are going like, I know this isn't true from my own life, how on earth do you expect to have any success in your campaign?
I know, it's tough, isn't it? It's just the same as telling people if they smoke cigarettes they get lung cancer, and some nitwit stands up and says, I didn't get lung cancer, and I'm not. It's always one. But no, experience, if I put forward such a daffy argument, I'd be accused of what is it, what is that word they always use? Anecdotal evidence. Anecdotal evidence, that's what you just did.